Great. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the Executive Director of the ACEC Research Institute, Daphne Bryant. Daphne?
Thank you, Carrie, and good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are today. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are excited to share with you some of the latest research from our Firm of the Future series. As Carrie said, redefining the firm, looking at talent, technology, and transformation. I have with me today Joe Bates, our Senior Research Consultant here at the Institute, and we are excited to share these findings with you. There is a lot to share, so I'm going to just go ahead and let's just jump in, Joe.
All right. Great, Daphne. Thank you very much. And thanks, Carrie, for the housekeeping notes today. So today, today's session really is built around this one central question that we have, and that is how must engineering firms evolve as we are seeing artificial intelligence? We have these workforce constraints. We don't have enough people, so we need to leverage AI to help us to become, better and more efficient. But AI is obviously much more than just that. We continue to see a lot of demand in the built environment from our sentiment surveys. We know firms are doing very well. There's more work than they can handle. Hard to hire enough people to keep up with the work. We still have a third of firms are turning down work because they don't have enough people. So there's all these different demands and areas that are hitting our industry. And now with AI, we see that there's this new sort of economics taking place, and it could even change the operating model. So everything we're going to talk about today is based on a report that we developed in collaboration with Mike Walsh. He's a futurist, and we're going to hear from him as well in part of our conversation today. We have him on video. So we created this report based on some of the work we did last year on AI as well as workforce, but also talking with around 20 leaders in the industry, engineering firms, as well as technology providers and other, AEC stakeholders. We even interviewed NVIDIA, individual at NVIDIA for the project. So there's a lot here that we learned. And so today, the first piece of this is we're going to talk about the main themes that came out of the report. And for each theme, we're actually going to hear directly from Mike Walsh in a short video that I'll share with you all. And then Daphne and I are going to talk a little bit about what he has said and how that might apply to firms. And the second half of what we're going to talk about today is our strategic roadmap. And this is also part of the full report. There's 6 practical steps that we're recommending firms take as they start on this journey with respect to artificial intelligence. So we want this to be interactive as well. So if you have questions, please post them. We'll get to them, throughout the presentation if you have them. And otherwise, we'll have some time at the end, we think, for discussion and questions as well. So first thing we're going to do here is we're going to hear from Mike Walsh, and I'm going to pull that video up right now.
Hi, I'm Mike Walsh, a futurist, the CEO of the Innovation Research Group Tomorrow, and the author of a number of books on AI transformation. I've been working on a brand new report with the team at ACEC on the future of the firm. As part of that process, we've spoken to both engineering firms and thought leaders across the technology industry. What we found was really fascinating. What basically emerged from all the conversations we had is that the engineering industry, as we know it, is approaching a pivotal moment, not because of a single technological breakthrough or a sudden economic shift, but because the fundamental logic of how engineering firms create value is now changing. If you think about it, for decades, that model was relatively stable. Firms scaled through people, projects were delivered through effort, value was measured in hours. But that model is increasingly under pressure. Artificial intelligence is entering the industry as a new form of digital labor, not just a new tool. Systems that can generate designs, run analysis, coordinate workflows are happening at a scale that was, frankly, previously considered impossible. At the same time, as many of you know, the demand for infrastructure is accelerating. while the supply of engineering talent is also tight. More work than people, more complexity than capacity. AI is arriving at exactly this moment. And as a result, the engineering firm is beginning to transform from scaling through labor to scaling through intelligence. And what we've seen is that across this revolution, 6 ideas are emerging. And we've grouped these into 3 deeper transformations. Firstly, how work is changing. Secondly, how firms are changing. And finally, how the entire industry is being redefined.
All right, so that's the introduction from Mike there, and I apologize. I switched our screens there for just a second. It's a lot going on when we have several windows and videos. But so as Mike was talking, I think the real shift here is, as he said, we're shifting this model. There's a business model shift. There's a paradigm shift. It's from labor to intelligence, and we consistently, as I mentioned, hear from firms that again, they have plenty of demand and it's hard to find talent. And so that's why this report isn't just about technology. It's actually about the future design of the firm itself.
Yeah, I think that's right, Joe. And the findings really challenge some of the assumptions that have really defined our firms for decades, right? When you think about how firms create value, how they develop talent, how they think about growth, this really has shifted from being a technology conversation to being a leadership conversation. And I think that's what we're starting to hear from firm leaders. We had over 50 leaders together just a couple of weeks ago talking about what's going on in the industry, and we heard this time and time again. So a lot of work, I think, to do here. But luckily, many of you are already jumping in. So
Yeah. So again, as Mike said, there's 3 main bodies, or there's three groups of themes. We're going to hear from Mike on each one. Daphne and I are going to talk again about each one. Um, so let's go ahead and go with the first theme. We're going to hear from Mike, and it's all about reconfiguring the work. So let me switch to that video, and here we go.
Let's start with the first of these, how work is being reconfigured. And this transformation is really going to the heart of how the practice of engineering is being performed, how problems are solved, where value is created in the day-to-day activity of engineers. And at its core, we believe that this is a shift from execution to orchestration. So let's start with the first of these ideas. AI is expanding capacity, not replacing engineers. We see the most immediate impact of AI not on workforce reduction, but on capacity expansion. Tasks that once consumed hours, document review, design iteration, compliance checks, are increasingly being automated or even accelerated. The result is not fewer engineers. It is engineers with far greater leverage. The constraint is no longer headcount. It's how effectively firms can combine human expertise with digital systems. The second idea is that we see in the future that engineers will become system orchestrators. As AI expands what can be done, it also changes what engineers do. Instead of producing solutions directly, engineers increasingly define the systems that generate those solutions. They set the constraints, they define objectives, they guide exploration. And as AI systems generate and evaluate thousands, even millions of possibilities, the role shifts from creating to orchestrating, from solving problems step by step to designing the very platforms that solve them, which only makes one thing more important than ever: human judgment.
So I think, for me, when we were conducting these interviews, one of the things that really stood out is that nobody talked about AI replacing people. They talked about AI being used in conjunction with engineering staff. And it's really interesting because all we hear about right now is, oh, AI is going to replace people. AI is going to replace people. But again, no one that we talked to at these engineering firms said that that's what they see in the future. They just see that it's going to change how we do our work. And that's where it leads into this idea of the engineers becoming the system orchestrators, right? The role of the engineer changes a bit, but well, not a bit, but a lot. But it's also just going to be expanding what you can do. The things you're able to do will expand.
Yeah, and I think, Joe, back to the leadership implication of this, firms are really going to need to rethink their talent development, right? And I think it even starts at the institutional level of how we're training our engineers before they even come into the firms. But if engineers are going to be spending less time producing and more time evaluating, interpreting, making decisions, to Mike's point, that judgment piece becomes even more important, right? And so I think that leads to some of the feelings that we're having of that, this can't replace the engineer, right? We still need that human judgment. But I think firms are going to need to be more intentional about developing skills in their people, whether it be critical thinking, problem solving, that professional judgment. As the AI takes on the routine work, there's these other pieces that really will still remain the human work that we're going to have to be very intentional around. And also then, as I was saying, the role for our learning institutions in this, what are we teaching students in the engineering programs? What needs to change? And ACEC and the Research Institute are having some conversations around that. We're bringing in some of the very groups that are in charge of that and some academics to have some of those conversations. So starting to dive into that aspect as well.
Yeah, and I think as you and Mike are talking about like the judgment piece, like we kept hearing that over and over and over again in these interviews that we're gonna have to have people who have good judgment. And I think that's again part of the skill set, right, that we're gonna have to be looking for. We're gonna talk more about that workforce piece in the second half of our conversation today. So next, let's go ahead and hear from Mike again on the second theme, reinventing the firm.
The second theme that we'd like to explore is this idea of reinventing the engineering firm. And this goes to the firm's structure, its economics, and ultimately the source of its competitive advantage. This is where the shift becomes structural, from organizations built on traditional labor to ones that are organized around intelligence. So the third idea that we've explored in the report is that the data itself is becoming a strategic asset. I mean, if you think about it, data has always been the heart of what firms do. Decades of project experience, the designs, the decisions, the outcomes, the performance. But historically, the data was either poorly stored or even sometimes forgotten. But in the future, it's going to become the very foundation for intelligence. It's going to allow firms to learn from every project, not just deliver the next one. And this will change the basis for competitive advantage from individual expertise of an engineer to institutional intelligence. The firm in this world doesn't just become a consultancy, but a platform for generating, applying, and scaling knowledge. The fourth idea is the hybrid human AI firm. So the composition of the firm is going to change. It's going to become a kind of a hybrid system where you have human engineers working alongside networks of AI agents, really digital labor that can simulate, analyze, validate, and optimize work, not just in sequence, but in parallel. The result of this will be smaller teams, greater output, more complex problems that are solved faster and better. The defining capability of the firm of the future is not the size of its workforce, but its capacity to orchestrate and organize. How effectively firms can coordinate and balance teams of humans and groups of AI agents.
So this second area of reinventing the firm, again, we're talking about two different pieces here. There's the data, and so let's talk about that first. I think a lot of firms realize that AI needs data to learn. They have a lot of data from past projects, but these projects might not have the data might not be stored in a way that is actually usable. So we have to think about how can we take advantage of the decades of knowledge that have in your firms, not just in those files, but even the people. When I've talked to some of these firms, they're saying, how can we capture the knowledge of the people that are going to be retiring as AI, becomes something that we integrate into the workforce? So I've been talking about how data is going to be the new gold, right? It's really a currency that AI is going to be using. So it's really important. We're going to be asking, what project, not just what projects have we completed, but what have we learned from those projects, and how can we apply that knowledge across the organization? And that's a fundamental shift in how firms think about data.
I think that's really the leadership piece, right, Joe? Is this is the leadership in this is becoming more and more important as we dig further in. Historically, I think firms have competed through their expertise, their relationships with their clients, and proven themselves that way. Going forward, they're going to need to figure out how to organize and govern and leverage this data, this strategic asset. And I think that's going to become just as important. The relationship and experience piece is not going to go away, but these other pieces around data are certainly going to be probably equally as important. And then I think the firms that are going to gain advantage may not be those necessarily with the most data,
Mhm.
but those that are able to really turn it into a value asset, right? Turn it into that intelligence that Mike was talking about. Um, and then this also raises another question in my mind around who owns the data. And I know we've had some, discussions about that. We had some discussions a couple weeks ago when we had the leaders together talking about, well, what about the contracts that I'm just now working on that I signed 7 years ago, 5 years ago? Like this wasn't built into that. We didn't talk about AI and data and so forth. And what do we need to put in contracts moving forward? So I think those are going to be other things that we're going to have to tackle in the very short term.
Yeah, and then when we talk about the second piece of this reinventing the firm, that the firm becomes this human, a hybrid human AI organization. It's very futuristic, right? You think about
Feels that way.
cyborgs, right? But we're not talking about like, a person with, another brain in their head or something. But we have to start thinking about how, as a firm, are we going to manage both the people and the digital labor? This idea of agents that we can create to perform work for us. And then how does the engineer manage that? So it's a whole new world when you start thinking about agentic AI. And these raise questions about, governance and accountability and quality assurance. There was one person I was talking to. This was actually a client, and they said they received a proposal that about for a bridge that they had wanted built, and there was a picture of the bridge that the engineering firm was proposing they were going to build. But the problem was in the middle of that bridge was a park. So someone obviously missed that. AI made a mistake, and someone missed that in the proposal. There's also risk that we have to address. There's a lot of risks with AI, and there's a lot of risks in engineering in general, but this opens up a whole new world of where are those risks and how we're going to mitigate those risks. And so we're actually conducting a study right now. We'll be publishing it probably later August or early September, and I'm working on that as well to understand where those risks are, so that firms are go in with open eyes to the whole AI landscape. So lots going on here, but let's go ahead and hear from Mike now again on the third theme, which is reinventing the industry, or redefining the industry, rather.
The third section is how will the industry itself change? This is where we move beyond the firm to the industry itself. Really going to the heart of how engineering firms deliver, how they engage with clients, where value is created across the entire life cycle of the built environment. The boundaries of the industry are going to begin to blur and shift. So the fifth idea is that infrastructure and assets become a form of continuous intelligence. As we said before, traditionally engineering was designed by its assets. We built assets and projects and then we moved on. But the built environment is no longer static. We have sensors, digital twins, and connected systems that are turning assets into continuous streams of data. The built environment itself is becoming a living system, generating insight about performance, risk, and optimization in real time. This is going to change the model for engineering firms from episodic delivery to continuous intelligence, from one-off projects to long-term forms of engagement. The real value is going to shift to the project being delivered to what happens after the construction is complete. And that's the final idea we want to talk about, which is the potential emergence of AI native firms. Firms that were designed from the ground up to be based around digital systems, not retrofitted with them afterwards. They're going to operate differently. Automated workflows, integrated data platforms, AI-driven delivery models. This is going to change the competitive landscape because in this new world, the question is no longer how do we effectively use AI, but rather how does a firm look like when it's been designed with AI at its core foundation?
I think that is, to me, that's probably one of the most profound aspects of this entire study. When we look at, infrastructure becoming a continuous asset, it's again, it's not just something that you have built and then you move on to your next project. It's opens up the possibility of designing roads or bridges or buildings and having all of this data that you're now monitoring the performance of that asset and when does it need to be fixed or rehabilitated, or when is there a problem that needs to be addressed. And so a firm could choose to extend its services throughout the life cycle of an asset. And that's something that I think is really not been thought of in the past.
I think it really opens up a very different growth opportunity, right? It's instead of focusing just on winning the project and completing that project, I think now we're going to be looking more increasingly at how do we help clients, as you were saying, Joe, manage the performance, optimize the operations, reduce risks, know when something's wrong ahead of time, make better long-term decisions. And so when you think about it that way, right, the relationship doesn't end when the project's delivered. It continues on, and there's a whole new revenue possibility there as well.
Yeah, and one of the interviews that I've done, not for this particular study, but I'm doing dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews with different people. So I talked with the someone in North Carolina's DOT that handles their roads and their turnpikes and their tolling, and they're going all in. Like, this is a client that's going all in on monitoring their systems and automating their systems. A really interesting story. They had some interns one summer, a few summers ago when they first started this, and they had this person who was running the tolls, and they couldn't figure out who it was because the person had a device that flipped up their license plate so that the toll reader couldn't see their license plate, and they couldn't figure out who this guy was, and so they had these interns came in. The interns started using AI, and within 24 hours they figured out who the guy was because they were pulling information from cameras that were around these tolling booths and other locations, and they knew the make and model of the car. They just didn't know the license plate. So it was really interesting, And again, this was one of the clients. So the other idea here, right, is AI native competitors. So you could think of if these interns created this new operation to identify toll runners and toll violators, you could have firms that are going to be created for specific purposes or for purposes that are much much broader. And we're seeing a couple of those occur. They're not too many that we know of at the moment, but there are a few that are popping up on our radar screen. And so, what does a firm look like when it's designed around AI from the start? And I think that's what we're just beginning to see.
Yeah, I know that you guys interviewed one of those firms, and when Mike was first talking to us about this, AI first firm, it reminded me of, several years ago when we were all moving to smartphones, and we started talking about our websites being mobile first, right? Instead of focused on someone accessing it from their laptop. And so it sort of reminds me of that transition as well. We're talking about potential changes in business models, client relationships, competitive advantage, and even who the future competitors may be. And so these are some big strategic questions that I think leadership teams all across our industry really need to be thinking about and talking about now, right? We've talked to some firms who have said, yeah, we think it's going to affect us in the next couple of years, and I'm not an AI expert, but I would argue it's now that we need to be having those discussions.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll say, Daphne, is, in some of the other studies we're conducting right now, we're talking to sort of the more let's say typical firm, right? That's not on the leading edge. And we're hearing this idea of being a fast follower. That's something that is really coming out. But then there's also firms who they just don't see the need or the value yet. And I'm a little concerned because I see the possible future here in this study, and firms that don't start at least figuring out how to utilize AI in some form, I really feel like they're going to get left behind. So all right, well, that's the first part of our discussion today, and the first part of the report. And again, if you have questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be happy to address those. But in the meantime, we can go ahead and start talking about the second part of our session today. And so we talked about those big three themes, how the work is changing, how the firm is changing, and how the industry itself could change. So now we want to turn to this roadmap. And again, this is in the report. There's 6 things that we think are important for firms to start working on now. And there's more than 6, but these really come out from those main themes. And so the first one is
Hey, Joe,
building.
before you
Oh,
jump
yeah, go
into
ahead.
that, I was just going to add, I think it's important to let the audience know that we're going to show you the 6 themes, but there's no single sequence of steps for these, right? That a firm should follow or must follow. So think of them more of, I think Mike refers to them as strategic moves, and they could be done in a whole different order, a combination of different ways depending on your firm's size, capabilities, ambitions, what your strategic plan is. In fact, in the report itself, we call out differences between small firms and larger firms for each of these. So we talk about, in a larger firm, it might look like this, in a smaller firm, it might look like that. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage for that before we talked about them. These are not necessarily sequential. In fact, they're probably not sequential.
Yeah, you're right, Daphne. They're not in any particular order. And from our prior research, I think it's important to say you first have to have an overall strategy, right? You have to have a firm-wide strategy and what you're wanting to do with AI, what your goals are with AI. These steps are assuming that you've already done that part. So that's something you have to keep in mind as well. All right, so one of the strategies is around data. We talked about that. You have to build a firm-wide data strategy. Again, data is becoming the new gold, right? It's becoming one of the most valuable assets that your firm will have, whether you're a small firm or not. Like if you specialize in building bridges and you've built, or you've designed 100 bridges, well, you got a lot of data there, right? If you're a large firm, you're going to have even more data, but in lots of different areas. And AI can only create this value if it can access the data, if it can learn from high quality knowledge. And so you're going to have to create a strategy. The challenge is that again, most firms will have decades of projects, and sometimes firms that are 100 years old or even 50 years old, some of that's just going to be on paper, right? And how do
Mhm.
you access that as well? So there's all that project experience, technical knowledge, client insights that you may have in your own knowledge or that you may have captured somehow, and it's fragmented across your organization. So you have to figure out how are you going to bring all this data together. And that's not an easy challenge. It means understanding where the data resides, any policies that you have regarding the use of data, uh, if you can reuse that data. And so it's not just file management, it's being able to make better decisions, increase your speed of learning. And again, the idea is value, right? Creating new forms of value.
Yeah, I think from a leadership perspective, right, those are the key things is what data do we have, where is it, and how can we use it to create that value? I think a lot of firms have invested pretty heavily in technology, not just AI, but other forms of technology that they're using in their firm. And the next challenge may really be about investing in information governance. We talked a bit about this a little bit at the front end. The governance piece is important, the quality of the data. To your point, Joe, is it on a piece of paper or is it in a system? And then that knowledge management piece. So I think firms that succeed will be able to take take that data and transform it into that intelligence that Mike referenced earlier in the video.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot to do here. But let's move on to our second step. And again, not in any particular order, but this is about redesigning engineering workflows around AI. So, again, we're not talking about a brand new AI firm. We're talking about your existing firm and how are you going to integrate AI? So many firms are experimenting with AI today. We know this from our business sentiment survey. And in fact, most firms are experimenting, and very, very few have implemented on an enterprise level AI when it comes to design and engineering services. So the labor opportunity, sorry, the larger opportunity here is not simply adding AI to existing processes, it's really rethinking how your work is organized from the beginning. You have to go back to the drawing board, and it's not where can we add AI, it's how should this work be performed if we have an intelligent system that are part of the process from the start. So that's a whole different way of thinking about it. AI can support design exploration, and compliance reviews, simulation, documentation, again, knowledge retrieval, but we have to have human expertise as that you talked about earlier, Daphne, judgment. And that's, I think, one of the critical words that, we just keep hearing over and over and over and over again is judgment and decision making. So you're going to have all these information and you'll have more information than you've ever had before. And so you have to be able to think critically about it. So you have to concentrate this human effort where it creates the greatest value.
And back to your kind of first point on this one, Joe, is that experimentation, right? Like there's no other way to do it but to try. People talk a lot about fail fast, and I think that probably applies here. But I think firms are going to need to identify high value processes. They're going to need to test AI enabled approaches, um, measure those results, and then the things that work well, scale those, right? And scale them quickly. And I think firms that are going to gain the greatest advantages are not necessarily those with the best technology or the most data, like I said earlier, but really those that are able to successfully re-engineer, redesign their operating models to be more efficient with the use of AI, and then that hybrid AI employee work piece, right? And being able to be successful at that.
And I really think the QA QC process becomes more important because we know AI makes mistakes. I've had the experience myself where I'm not being careful
We've all
enough.
seen the pictures with the hands coming out of the head, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and what I heard some firms talk about is they're starting to use AI to check AI. So that's an interesting development as well. And how thoroughly then, but and so one person we talked to said that they're doing that, but they still have to have a human-centered approach, right?
Yeah.
There's this, you're building workflows around AI, but you still have to have humans involved. AI cannot just go off and design a bridge all on its own. I don't know if we'll get to that point or not, but we're not there now for sure. So that's a really important aspect of this redesigning the workflow. And that kind of segues into our next area, which is developing this hybrid engineering talent, right? The future engineer is going to have different skills that are required. They're going to have to understand not just engineering, and they're going to have to learn engineering in a practical application, right? But they're going to have to be fluent digitally. They're going to have to be fluent and literate with data itself and how systems think, how AI thinks. They're going to have to understand AI itself, how it works and how the output is generated. So this is a whole different engineer that we're going to see, say, 10 years from now than what we see today. And as this routine work becomes automated, the engineers can then spend more time framing the problems. I've also talked with folks and they said, we're thinking about this in reverse, right? We're going to say, this is what we want as an outcome. And then we work from that backwards, right? And so that's a different way of thinking about it as well. You're going to have to interpret these outputs. You have to validate assumptions. You have to communicate these decisions. I think, again, there's a lot of emphasis on being able to take the information that AI can give you and translating that into options for clients or making the judgment of which options you want to present to your clients. So this is, it's a new challenge for recruiting and training and even developing individuals throughout their career. So it's not just training engineers how to use AI, like that's the first step, but it's developing professionals who can then combine the human judgment along with the intelligent systems. It's really a whole new world.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it also creates new questions around workforce development, right? And even before I said touched on this a little bit earlier, but even before they're in our workforce, right? What are institutions doing to prepare our future engineers beyond what they have typically done around an engineering curriculum? And so how do we train them? How do we help them gain judgment? How do, the judgment we keep talking about, Joe, is the important piece, but if they're not doing all the steps, and I've talked to a lot of CEOs who have said this to me, like, well, if they're not doing all the things, how are they going to like gain the knowledge and the judgment? And so there's new efforts around training that are going to have to be developed. How do we prepare leaders to manage this combined human digital capability? And then that human judgment piece, right? We've just got to continue to put the emphasis on that. Someone at the end of the day, at least today, still has to stamp that drawing, so to speak, and it can't be the AI agent. Um, and then I think, one of the biggest strategic priorities for firms is going to be this talent development piece. How do they continue to bring those along, especially those who have been in the workforce for a while? For some, this is a challenging. We learned that in our workforce study that we did last year, right? That this is really a challenge for them to make this leap over. So a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, and people keep thinking that AI is going to make their job easier, and in some ways I think it does, right? But let me give you an example which I think highlights the importance of that human judgment and the need to still differentiate what you're going to offer your clients. So I talked to a client And they said, they said, yeah, we actually, I'm sorry, it was not a client, it was a design firm. And they said, we submitted a proposal to a client. The client called us in, and they called one of our competitors in at the same time, and they sat us down. And the client gave the competitor my proposal, and they gave me the competitor's proposal. So they switched it, and we looked, and we are like, wait, they're both the same. Like each firm provided the exact same proposal. There was one word different, and it was because they were using the same AI system to generate the proposal. So if you do end up having AI systems that can, create the same types of things, then you have to use that human judgment. You have to use your human experience to differentiate what you're providing from what someone else could provide. I think that's super, super important. And I don't think a lot of people are thinking about that right now. All right, well, Daphne, let's move on to the next one here, which is this opportunity to expand services around the infrastructure and across the infrastructure life cycle, right? We sort of talked about this a little bit already, but in terms of the theme, but what you have to do as an engineering firm is going to be very, very different again, right? So historically, firms have focused on just, again, the planning, the design, and the construction, and then that's it. And now we have this infrastructure asset that's going to operate for decades, and we can generate value from this long after the design and even the construction is finished. So you have AI, you have digital twins, you have these sensors, networks of sensors that you can build into the structures that you're constructing, and you can then eventually create these predictive analytics that allow firms to, again, engage throughout the life cycle. So, okay, we see this happening this year, and in 6 months, this other thing has now happened. So, okay, we know from our history that in 6 months, we're going to have to perform some action, right? So even though the design process, I think, will be compressed because you'll be able to design more efficiently, you'll have other things you can offer across the life cycle of that asset. So the engineering firm of the future, it's not the project doesn't end at delivery. The project could extend well beyond delivery of that project.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most important strategic ideas in the report, and really has the ability to create deeper client relationships and longer term relationships, and quite frankly, just new revenue opportunities for firms, right? I think clients may increasingly need support with asset performance, operational optimization, predictive maintenance, risk management, a lot of the things that you're talking about, Joe, long-term planning. And so the opportunity for our firms to evolve from being just that project provider into long-term partners with these clients around that same asset, right? That a lot of times we have long-term partnerships around multiple projects, but I think that managing and helping to improve that asset performance over time is an opportunity. And so to your point, right, that the firm's not going to be defined by just what it designs any longer, but maybe how it helps clients manage that infrastructure after it's built and well into its life cycle.
Right. So the next item here, and again, please send us your questions if you have them, and we'll be happy to address them. The next item here is leveraging the industry collaboration for scale. So what does this mean? This is a little bit different. And the idea here is that AI-enabled infrastructure requires coordination, right? The coordination between engineering firms, maybe among engineering firms, technology providers, contractors, owners, regulators. There's a lot of different people that would be involved across this life cycle, right? So you're going to have to think about that. And then the data will move throughout these organizations. And so you have to have standards of what can be shared, governance about how you can share. You must align this governance with your partners. And so the report suggests that some of the biggest disruptions may actually come from outside the engineering industry as well, right? Firms that stay isolated risk becoming disconnected from where that value is being created. And so you have to think about that as well. But again, the idea is that you're going to have to collaborate. You're going to have to work with your partners, not just in the way that you do it now, but in a different way that extends across this project, and extends beyond the project throughout the life cycle of that asset. And so the idea isn't just whether you should collaborate. You really will need to. The question is, where will you choose to collaborate? With whom will you choose to collaborate? And how are you going to differentiate yourself, as we talked about earlier?
Yeah, I think this is really a place, Joe, where organizations like ACEC and the Research Institute can play a role in helping industry to kind of learn and align and move forward together. I think many of the challenges that are associated with AI are simply too large for any one firm to solve alone, right? And so a bit of that all boats rise type of mentality as we think about issues like interoperability, governance, risk, cybersecurity, even the workforce development piece. I think there's collective work that we can do. And, ACEC has the workforce consortium, for example, that's working on tackling that. You mentioned we're tackling the AI risk study now. The governance piece is going to be big, and I think the ACEC advocacy team is going to have work to do on many of these fronts. So, in addition to that, we haven't really talked about this much, but the whole idea around pricing and value-based pricing and moving away from time and materials, right? How are we going to pay for all of this if it's taking us less time? We've had this conversation, I feel like a million times in the past year, right? It's if it's taking me less time, how am I going to recoup my costs? And so we've got a big value-based pricing study that we're working on as well to help in these areas. But it really is going to take us as an industry to move this forward and really to help educate our clients. There's a lot of work to do there from, I think, an education and an advocacy perspective that ACEC and the Research Institute can help align on.
And earlier, Daphne, you highlighted the fact that the report has different, ideas and strategies for small, medium, and large firms. And I think this is one of those areas really where there could be very different approaches depending on your firm size. If you're a small firm and you don't have as much data as you need, maybe you've only been around 10 years and you need more data. Well, can you create a consortium of small firms that will be able to pool their data together? That's one thing that we've talked about as well internally, and how can ACEC help facilitate that? If you're a large firm, again, the idea as well, are you going to collaborate with other providers? Are you going to, start your own AI team internally? Are you going to get folks from outside? Are you going to buy an AI firm?
Buy or build.
Yeah, right. So there's all these questions about how are you going to leverage this, the industry collaboration for scale, right? But there's a lot to think about here for sure. The last of the six roadmap steps is kind of going back to the workforce again, and it's preparing to manage this digital workforce. This is, I think, a really, really huge task. I've talked to some HR people as well, and they're already thinking about this, right? We talked about different skills you need, and our firm's going to start hiring with people with different skills. Are they going to require them to have these different skills? But then there's this whole idea of managing this digital workforce. So the report argues that AI is evolving from a tool into an actual form of labor, right? Again, the idea is that you have an AI agent doing this piece of work, you have another agent doing another piece of work. So as these AI systems become even more and more capable, firms could find themselves managing not only the teams of engineers, but the networks of these AI agents performing the tasks and such as analysis, documentation, compliance review, and design validation. So how do you manage AI agents? That I'm not even sure I know yet, right? Like this is a brand new area that's going to be emerging in the next few years is agentic AI. And so think about if you have 20 agents that are helping an engineer do work, you got to know how to manage those 20 different agents. So it's just a whole new area of exploration and figuring out how that's going to work. So it's a really deep shift from, again, just thinking about humans to thinking about this hybrid system of humans and machine intelligence.
Yeah, and I think, look, our engineering firms know how to manage people, right? They've been doing that for decades. The challenge now is extending those disciplines and maybe some new disciplines into that hybrid digital workforce. And because, as we've said, right, Joe, the accountability doesn't disappear because of AI being involved. In fact, it's probably even stronger, and more important. And so I think the firms that succeed will not necessarily be those that adopt the most technology, but really those that are best at integrating the human judgment, the professional responsibility, the digital capacity and capabilities into one operating model, right? So that goes back to that operational piece and workflows and reorganizing yourselves. Um, there's going to be some choices that firms are going to need to make, right, about how they're going to differentiate themselves, as you said earlier. What capabilities are going to matter most within their firm? Where can they create that unique value for their clients? And those, lots of leadership questions here, right, that all need to be addressed. And as I said earlier, I would argue sooner rather than later.
So a reminder, please put your questions in. We're just about ready to answer any questions you all have as we start to sort of give you our closing thoughts. So the idea here, the central message of the report is that AI is not just another technology. And I've talked with a lot of firms and a lot of firm leaders, and they do feel that it's just another technology. We've been through new technologies before, and this is not going to be any different. And we're arguing that it is. We're arguing that this is actually going to be very, very different. It's going to reshape the logic of the engineering firm, how the engineering firm is actually designed itself, right? How the engineering firm is designed. So capacity is no longer defined by just headcount. Data is not just a byproduct of what you're doing. Infrastructure is no longer just a delivered asset, right? All these things are changing, and engineering work is no longer defined just by production. So the firms that will lead are going to be those that redesign themselves. And that's really what we're talking about is you have to redesign the whole system around scalable intelligence while preserving that judgment, the trust that you have built with your clients, and the accountability that define the profession. It's very complicated what engineers do. And that's why we see AI augmenting engineering and not replacing engineers. So this is a really critical time in the next 5 years, even the next few years, as we move into this AI age.
I think, Joe, you made the point about not replacing engineers, right? AI is not replacing engineers. I think the greatest risk is that value moves outside of the firm. Does it move to technology platforms? Does it move to digital ecosystems? Does it move to some of these new entrants that we're talking about, that are better organized around data and intelligence? And I think that's really what our firms need to be focused on. And I think that's why this roadmap is so important, because it does give firms a way to begin thinking and acting now about organizing data and redesigning workflows, developing that talent, thinking about that life cycle services, right? Where does that fit into our firm strategy? Collaboration, so that we can scale this as an industry, and then really preparing to manage that digital labor. This is not all going to happen at once. As we said, these steps are not in any particular order. We're not going to, walk in tomorrow and implement all of this and be done. And we don't need to solve every one of these things immediately, but I think we do need to get started. That, I think, is really the key point here. So
So
Um,
Daphne, we had a comment first, just thanking us for conducting the study. But the question is, what's the next step for ACEC? Are there plans to conduct follow-up studies? Do you want to talk a little about that? I can also talk about that as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think we've mentioned some of them already, right? That we are in the middle of this AI risk study. We're in the middle of the value-based pricing study. And it's been really interesting as Joe's conducted all these interviews on a bunch of different fronts, how the dotted lines are connecting across all of these studies. We're hearing many of the same things. And so it's really helping to bring it all together. I mentioned, had about 50 industry executives together in our headquarters 2 weeks ago talking about what is next. What else do you all need? What's keeping you up at night? What are you concerned about? What are kind of some of the key uncertainties in our industry right now? And what research could the Institute be looking at to drive some answers to that? And so we came away with a big laundry list of ideas that the Institute board will be looking at. We have a call next week and then a meeting in September where we will be prioritizing those and really laying out our research agenda for the future. As I mentioned, ACEC is also involved in a lot of this, right, as it relates to education and advocacy on technology issues, on workforce issues. There's a group coming together now related to the education that's delivered, especially some of the more senior education and how to implement some new tracks around AI and management of hybrid workforce and those types of things. So it is high on the priority list across both organizations for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard firm leaders talking about is education. Like this is something that is coming back again and again and again. And this was in the context of my AI risk study. So, I thought that was interesting that people are thinking about educating the workforce and developing the workforce as a mitigation strategy for risk. But this is that part of what they have to do, as you start using AI. So there's a couple more questions. I think we have time for one of these, Daphne. What are we seeing as the differentiator in talent development with this changing landscape? And do you think it will impact licensing practices? So
It's
these
a
are,
great
yeah.
question. You should have been in our session 2 weeks ago. We are actually having some conversations with some academics as well as the licensure group, NCWS, who is the overarching group for all the licensing boards, around this very topic. In fact, I'm meeting with them in 2 weeks to talk about how can we help influence the what's happening at the universities, and also then how do the licensing boards stay up to speed on what they need to be focused on as well. I think Joe, you shared with me in one of your interviews, you were asking, okay, well, from a legal perspective, right? What are you doing around AI? And they were kind of like, well, what we do for everything else, just apply it to AI. It's, just slap that on there. And that's probably not the best answer, right? So we've got some work to figuring that out.
Yeah, and addressing the first part of that question, what are you seeing as the differentiator in talent development? I think it's still to be seen, right? But what I'm starting to hear is that firms are putting in job descriptions nice to haves as opposed to requirements, right? You want all the basic engineering requirements, but then they're starting to add in these nice to have, like and they're things that aren't focused on engineers, right?
Mhm.
It's computer science. It's under just have you used Chat GPT and how have you used it? So it's I think the differentiator perhaps this is just one thought because I think we're still trying to really understand this, but one differentiator is finding engineers who have a very broad understanding and of technology as well, and particularly artificial intelligence. And I think that then ties back into what are the universities doing to help train the next generation of engineers that are going to be utilizing AI. So I think there's a lot more for us to think about, but these are great questions. Thank you all for that. And I just want to throw up before we finish the QR code. This will take you to the full study, the full report with a lot. It's a great read, very, very intriguing. It's a little long, maybe 70 pages, but honestly, you get sucked into it. It's really, really interesting. So
Best beach read ever.
yeah, especially if you're on a flight, and this you'll be impressed with, I think, this report.
And
Um,
Joe, just before we
yep.
close out, yeah, I just want to thank our donors who made this project possible. Without them, obviously, we would not be able to do any of the work that we do at the Institute. So I know many of you are represented on this call today. Thank you very much for your engagement and your financial support to make all of this possible. If you're not on this screen and you'd like to be, please reach out to me. Always happy to add some new logos to our donor family. So with that, we will close out. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the report. Reach out afterwards if you have questions, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Future of Engineering Roundtable. Have a great afternoon.